and welcome as now we come to the fifth Sunday, fifth weekend of the Lenten season. This will bring us two-thirds through the season of Lent. And let me begin, I'll give you with the readings. First reading, again, comes from our favorite prophet Isaiah, chapter 43, verses 16 through 21. The center reading comes from Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 8 through 14. And the gospel, now this is where there's a variant on the theme this time. The gospel comes from the gospel tradition according to John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Now, as you know, we are looking at this time, the gospel guide for our season happens to be that of the third gospel, namely of Luke. So why, on this particular Sunday, do we break ranks with what we've been kind of looking at to take a gospel passage from that of John? And the reason is that the choice of the story that we will hear this time seems to have been an important story that floated around in the early Christian communities. And as best, in one of the interpretations, I was going to say as best as we can, find that the origin of this particular story probably began in what we call an oral tradition. In other words, it wasn't a story that was written down, but it was a story that was told among various different communities of believers, not only in Israel, but also in other places where, as we moved into the 2nd and 3rd century, the gospel message was being shared. So we get a little bit of this background because we now have an episode that in some ways, and the reason for putting it into John, we'll look at that a little bit, makes some sense. But in some ways, this particular account much more reflects the thinking and mentality of the third gospel, namely of Luke. So it's for that reason I would suggest that this episode is brought to our attention this week. Well, what is this episode that he is talking about? Well, the scene, as we will see, is that Jesus is pictured as teaching in the temple area. And we have noticed on other occasions, certainly, that the temple had a specific section of the outer temple area, which was set aside for philosophers and for thinkers who would gather together their disciples and who would instruct them. It was an opportunity to teach them something both about the word of Scripture, but also something about life in general. So that's the setting, and this would work from the viewpoint of the fourth gospel writer, John, because Jesus had been talking prior to this about being healing a man, being the light of the world, and then there's this break. And again, I've not mentioned the story yet, but there's this break that someone, somewhere in the, maybe, and this is why I stop here, someone, somewhere, some group interjected this story into John's episode. Because, well, he is teaching in the temple area, and there's a group around, and as we will hear, the episode begins as Jesus was there teaching. The Pharisees and the scribes bring in a woman who has been caught in the act of adultery, and they bring her in and place her in the center. Now, in the center of what? We can only picture that the kind of disciples and listeners about Jesus' teaching were centered around him. There's Jesus up in front, and the group gathered around, not with him up there, but kind of as you might imagine them. And by placing the woman in the center, certainly has made her the object of attention. And all of that might fit what John's gospel is all about and what he has been talking about so far for this group. So keep in mind that as the episode is brought to our attention, it's an interruption in a teaching that Jesus has already been doing. And if you want to kind of follow what this is all about, you read in John's gospel what happens up to the end of chapter 7, and you pick up that there's a kind of continuity between what he says at the end of chapter 7 and in chapter 8, the beginning of verse 12. So you see, this might and is considered as an interruption or an addition. All right, so the woman is brought before Jesus, placed in the center, and then those who have brought her there, the scribes and the Pharisees, say, now this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery, and the law says that she should be stoned. And what do you say, Jesus? Now, it's interesting here that as it is presented, they bring the woman before Jesus. And it's not just before Jesus, but if you think about it, it's also before this whole crowd that he is teaching, saying, what do you think you should do is a test. So are they really interested in what the tradition says, or are they more interested in kind of trapping Jesus so that he will look bad in front of this group and the Pharisees and scribes who are planning, looking for an opportunity to get Jesus? Here it now might be the occasion. All right, so the woman is pictured as being caught in the act of adultery. Now, keep in mind, what is the understanding of adultery in the ancient world, or certainly in the world that we are looking at here in the gospel, that the key figure in this kind of act is the wife, all right? And the key issue is the loss of honor, the bringing of shame to her husband. So again, this is a very patriarchal situation. We've noticed this, and that's how this works. So now, what has the woman done? There's a lot of unanswered questions here with regard to the woman, and one of the things that we notice is that the woman is treated as an object, not as a person. And that's something perhaps that certainly Jesus is aware of, and that the group ought to have been aware of. All right, so we're not sure what exactly she has done, if anything, all right? Now, has the woman, and you might notice if someone is caught in the act of adultery, the law says, and that's why they're presenting it to Jesus, because in two places in the tradition, there is reference to what should be done to those who are caught in the act of adultery. Now also keep in mind that in adultery, one of the partners is already married, okay? And the woman who is caught is bringing, as I mentioned, dishonor rather, to the man. And of course, you don't want to do that. You remember, you didn't want to do that, that the woman in this society, and we have noticed this certainly on many other occasions, you will like this, that sometimes the thought was that women were oversexed and that therefore they're needed to have male kind of, well, not control, but watchfulness over what women did. And the key men in that process were a father was to look after his daughter, a brother was to look after his sister, and a husband was to overlook and take care of his wife. Now, you might smile and say, wow, but that's kind of the way in which things were understood. And if a husband, for example, suspected that his wife was engaged in adultery, he could, according to the book of Numbers in chapter 5, through verses 11 through 31, so it's quite a process, put the woman through what was called a trial by ordeal, okay? And it sounds like something that comes out of movies, but it was a test. And if the woman passed it, well, then she was considered to be innocent. But if she failed, well, then she was to be stoned. The chances of passing in this kind of test were minimal. If you set up a test that it's too weighted in one way, you can imagine what the end result often would be. So if adultery could be proven, and again we go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verses 22, says, now this is interesting, that both partners in the act were to be killed. All right? So in this case, the guilty, and it's interesting, the guilty woman is caught in the very act of adultery. So now you have to ask, how does this work? Caught in the very act. Now, certainly a man and a woman aren't laying outside in the front lawn doing this so that those pass by could witness this. Or were those who witnessed this standing at the window of the house where this was happening and saw it? If so, doesn't that seem that perhaps it was kind of a setup? And that's part of the kind of thought here. How did they know that this was going on, those witnesses? And who are exactly these witnesses? Are they the scribes and the Pharisees here who brought her before Jesus? And of course, most importantly, you might say, and we might all say, where is the guy? If this is what adultery requires, after it takes two to make this work, where is the other? Why is he not here? So you can see that we can see that there are certain things that are certainly missing here that should have been taken care of. So the woman is caught. We're not sure who the two witnesses are. We also have to raise interesting questions, and of course much discussion by different interpreters has gone on with regard to this. Did the husband know, that is, of the woman, that she was engaged in this activity with another man? And was it a setup? In other words, it didn't just happen that they were walking by or heard about it and saw it, but that really it was all a plan. You can see where this later on becomes the subject of movies that kind of very much use this idea of trapping a person that you didn't like or wanted to get rid of in circumstances that were quite dishonorable and unfavorable. All right, so all of those are kinds of questions that aren't answered and that might be raised, okay? Was this, as I mentioned, really a trap? In other words, now, keep in mind, as it's presented here, this is done as a test of Jesus. Now, how does this serve as a trap for Jesus or a test? Jesus, if he opposes her execution, he must explain why he has gone against the law of Moses, because in reading in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it does set up for this kind of situation to take place. But if he approves of her execution, he can then be visioned as usurping Roman prerogatives by causing her execution to take place. Now, what we do know, and we perhaps have noticed this on other occasions, that when the Romans entered into the ruling situation of Judea, particularly in the Jerusalem area, prohibited executing anyone unless Rome gave the permission. And we know that this was in place somewhere around the year 30. So keep in mind, Jesus' own ministry was shortly at that time. So it would have been perhaps well known that no execution could be given by any other person, and certainly this would put Jesus in a most difficult position, see? So they think they have a trap, okay? Either he keeps the law of Israel, which is what he as a teacher, and after all, here are those sitting around and kind of learning, would notice, or does he appear in what would turn out to be a treasonous act, going against Roman rule by allowing a woman to be executed? So it looks like they have caught Jesus in a no-win situation. Either he does this or that. It's either going to be a yes or no decision on his part, and whichever way he goes, he's not going to be favorably received. Now, you know and remember what Jesus does, all right? Having now, and keep in mind the way in which the woman is placed in the center so that everybody can notice, as we've mentioned a couple times here, objectifies her. They're not concerned in her as an individual, as a person, but they're simply using her as a way to make a case or a point that will trap Jesus. What he does, you remember, is that he bends down and he then begins to do something in the ground, in the dirt, in the dust. Now, where, you might say, would there be dust in the temple area? Well, as was noted on other occasions, reconstruction of the temple area was going on during the time of Jesus. It had begun by by Herod the Great, not the current Herod Antipas, but his son, but by Herod the Great. It began a major reconstruction of the temple area, and that was still going on in Jesus' time, and was not completed until about the year 65 of the Common Era. So, my point is that there would have been dust or dirt for Jesus to be writing in because of the construction that was going on. In other words, you would have thought like your kind of nicely swept church when you go there on weekends, the floor and everything is clean. Well, why wasn't the temple area like that? Well, because of construction that was going on. And I just put all these little things into a perspective here that are not all that important, but might be interesting in noticing the larger picture here. Now, what exactly does Jesus write? Anyway, he does this writing after, we don't know how long it took him, how long everyone was patiently watching, and I'm sure you kind of get the scene, you know. All right, we're looking for an answer. Now he bends down. Now he's doing something on the ground. What's he doing? Who even noticed? Those who were closer to him? Did he write in huge script, or did he write in ordinary script? We don't know. At a certain point, so the time is not given here, when you hear the reading, it just you got to fill in the blank yourself, stands up and says, "Let those who are without sin cast the first stone." You see, picture Jesus is kind of clever here because he's not giving an answer. He's rather raising a question. And isn't that one way sometimes in discussions that we have? People ask us a question. Well, rather than give an answer, we find a way to not answer their question by throwing back to them our own question, and which they need to answer before we will answer. It's clever dynamic if it works, and in this case, Jesus says that, let the one who is without sin cast the first stone, then bends down again to the ground and continues his writing. All right, while we're here, what exactly was Jesus writing on the ground? Now, different interpreters, and there is no answer given in the reading that we see this time. So again, it's a kind of opportunity to fill in the blank. Jesus is picked, some say he is writing the Decalogue with his finger. Now, what's the Decalogue, the famous commandments? Is he really writing them all? This would take a little bit of time and a little bit of room if that's what he was doing. But some say that, or others say that of the Decalogue, Jesus is saying, well, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. Are those the ones that he would be writing? Or would he be writing, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul? So nobody who says that can, or some do, attempt to fill in the dialogue of whatever it was he was writing. Others say that really, and here, because they want to illustrate the kind of insight that Jesus has, began writing in the dust or in the ground the sins of those who were gathered around, or those who were accusing him of doing things that were wrong. So is he kind of visiting, so I know what you did, here it is, embarrassing or putting dishonor to that particular person. You, all right, here we go. Now, that's another interpretation. It does say, in the text that we hear this time, that as Jesus was doing this, they began to leave and go away. Remember the question, let the one who is without sin cast the first stone, began to leave with the elder going first. Now, this is the reverse order, because in situations like this, where some kind of judgment was required, it generally was that the younger would go first, because the understanding was that if the elder went first, the younger would be influenced to perhaps make their decision based on what the elder had done. So the law says, or the custom said, when the younger went first, they had to make their own decision without it being banked by what the wisdom of or the situation of the elders or the olders were. So although that's not mentioned, it is kind of interesting that the older leave first out of this. And then you can only imagine it goes down the line till Jesus stands up and looks around and says to the woman, now, I'm not sure if this were taking place, and this is where the situation of this story in John's Gospel at this point doesn't exactly fit, because remember, he had been teaching a group. Now, did the whole group leave? Or who were those who had brought Jesus, the woman caught in the act of adultery? Was it just a few? So who are those exactly who have left? It's not explained, but when he says that everyone was gone, well, how large was the group that he had been teaching? Were they also included? Did he, as they brought this woman to Jesus, did they want to include the audience that Jesus had been teaching in the decision that he was going to make? So you see, there are certain methods of interpretation here that would capture our attention. But what is said then as Jesus stands up, there is no one there but the woman. See, so everyone has left. Now, as I mentioned, who are the everyone? But best to say, there is no one there who would be in a position of making an accusation that they were sinless. See, so in that way, it does make sense. By the way, just finishing this up, if Jesus were writing in the ground, perhaps he wasn't writing at all. Perhaps he was doing, and I like this one, something that when you're listening on the phone, used to be when it was a kind of stationary phone. Now I suppose it's your pocket phone and you can just lay it down and walk away. But when somebody is talking and talking and talking, and you have to stand there and wait, you doodle, okay? You draw figures and just to do something while Aunt Sarah is telling you all of her problems that you've heard 5 times before, but she's telling you again. So that's all that Jesus was doing. He was just spending time giving those who were standing around an opportunity to lead. So I like that one, but others say, there were more serious things that he was doing with his finger in the ground, all right? And when he stands up, he says to the woman, well, there's no one here to condemn you, is there? And she says, no, there's no one. Obviously, you can almost kind of smile and say, if they're all gone, obviously no one is here. Why is the woman still here? Well, because she obviously had been caught in an action which violated the rules of the time. And Jesus then says to her, neither do I condemn you. Now, the last sentence is interesting. Jesus says, go and sin no more. Now, some think that this last sentence, these last words, were added to the Gospel of John at this point in the story that we hear, because it really, the whole issue about sin has not been under discussion. And Jesus is pictured, you remember, often as saying, judge not and you will not be judged. Now, if Jesus says to her, go and sin no more, he has made a judgment that indeed she has sinned. Now, is he forgiving her? There's no indication of that. He is, however, just saying, go, obviously, because there is no one here to accuse you. And so I will not stand and be as judge because there is no one here to give the evidence that would establish the fact that you are in some way guilty of some action. So it's an interesting kind of little story ending with just Jesus and the woman alone. And you can kind of picture, we're not sure where the woman came from, what she had done. As I mentioned, there's a lot of background that was missing with regard to her tradition. If indeed this had been a setup, would she return back to the situation where she had been forced into this? Had the woman and we'll just conclude with this, had the woman even been raped and brought before Jesus for this crime? So there's a lot that is at work here. There's a kind of argument against women being treated as property. Certainly a lot of argument that the woman is treated as an object rather than as a person. Jesus, of course, treats her as a person. No one has accused you, neither do I, so please go. And maybe that woman went on to become a disciple of Jesus, for all we know. So it is one of the more interesting stories that is remembered in the tradition. You can see very much why it might belong to the tradition according to Luke, who is always reminding us of the great compassion and forgiveness of Jesus. If indeed she is guilty of that sin, then Jesus' forgiveness is also extended there. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.